Hello, Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 34 of the Secunda Secundae of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. The topic for this lecture is hatred, and I am Dr. Thibault. If you've been following along with videos as I post them, we took a bit of a break to finish doing videos on the transgender ideology book, and now I'm back to the virtues now that I'm done with that. So, if you found me because of the transgender videos, well, here's some general theology that might be helpful to you. So we are looking at the vices associated with the virtue of charity, right? So charity is a theological virtue, and they have vices, internal vices, hatred, sloth, and envy, and external vices, right? Discord, contention, schism, war, etc. Right? These are all against charity. Right? So we looked at the virtues, internal and external virtues associated with charity. Go back a couple questions for that. Now we're looking at the vices. So only 6 articles, pretty interesting questions, pretty interesting answers, and it should go quickly. So the first question article is, can a person have hatred of God? Right? Can you have hatred of God? And remember, God is infinite goodness, therefore God is the most lovable being, right? So God is the most lovable. So can you hate God? Right? It seems to be very contrary to God's nature, being the most lovable. But could you hate the most lovable being? Right? Like hating a little puppy, right? A very lovable being. But God is the most lovable. Could you hate God? Right? So first, in terms of God's essence as the most lovable being, because God is ultimately good, the greatest of good, you cannot hate God's essence. You can't, because there's nothing in it to hate. It's only lovable. Now, how about in terms of God's effects? Right? And this is now bifurcated. There's 2 types of effects. There's one which are desirable and lovable to all. Therefore, you can't, nobody could hate God for the things which is desirable and lovable to all. Right? The creation of earth, right? Material reality. Right? There's nobody who exists who can hate material reality. It's like hating sunsets or hating sunrises, right? There's nobody who hates these things, right? These are not hateable things, right? God creates love itself, right? So you can't hate love itself, right? So you could argue it, right? But there's some things that just everyone loves, right? It just doesn't make any sense to hate. But there are other things that are effects of God, which some people could hate, right? So God's judgment, God's punishment, right? So if you are damned to hell, you might hate that. You might hate that element. Now, is it bad? No, it's still good, right? Because God doesn't do bad. God only does good. So God's judgment is good. God's punishment is good. However, if you are on the receiving end of it, you might not perceive it that way, right? So our perceptions could then lead us to hate God's judgment, God's punishment, God's divine law, right? If you are committing adultery, you might hate the idea that adultery is a sin. Right? You don't want to feel judged. Why is God judging my adultery? Well, you might hate God for that, but it's not really God's fault that you hate divine judgment, right? But there are some people who can hate that. So people can hate God in terms of some effects of God, but you can't really hate God in terms of God's essence, because God's essence is just lovable. Now, in terms of is hatred of God the greatest of sin, right? So whenever we're dealing with the greatest virtue or the greatest of sin, this is asked all the time throughout the secunda secundae. The cardinal virtues, right? The next 4 virtues that we cover, the big virtues, right? Prudence, fortitude, right? prudence, fortitude, justice, temperance, right? The four. They went blank for a second, right? These are more earthly, more natural virtues, right? So because they're more natural virtues that are aimed at happiness within this life, some sense of the eternal, but it's Aristotle even writes about these cardinal virtues. They're not the greatest, right? The greatest are the theological, because the object of the theological virtues are God himself, right? So faith, hope, and love. So the greatest of these is love. Okay, so the greatest virtue and the greatest vice is going to be related to love, which makes sense, right? So we looked at mercy as greatest of virtue, and now hatred of God can be the greatest of vice. And St. Thomas points out that it is greater than unbelief, which is, we had already said before in the topic of faith, right? The vice of unbelief is bad, right? Unbelief. But unbelief with malice was worse, right? We said that in faith. If you go back to unbelief, you could say, well, didn't we say unbelief was the greatest of sins, right? Yes, but when we said that, it was unbelief with malice towards God, right? Not unbelief with ignorance or just kind of agnostic, right? You just don't have any feelings or thoughts. You never really considered it. That still can be a sin, but it's not it's not the greatest of sins. Sin would have some type of malice, some type of aversion to God, not just indifference, right? So St. Thomas says, but hatred of God is contrary to the love of God, wherein man's best consists. Therefore, hatred of God is man's worst sin, right? So if love of God is the greatest virtue, then hatred of God would be the greatest sin, just kind of naturally. St. Thomas says, when man hates God, his will is directly averted from God. Right? His will turns from God, whereas in other sins like fornication, man turns away from God not directly but indirectly. Right? If you steal from your neighbor, it's a violation of the precepts, but it's more a sin against your neighbor than it is against God, versus the hatred of God is entirely directed at God. Right? So it's kind of like blasphemy as well. Right? These are the greatest of sins because they are directed at God. Now, how about hatred of neighbor? Right? So hatred of neighbor is the greatest sin against one's neighbor. So hatred of God is the greatest sin against God. Hatred of neighbor is the greatest sin against your neighbor. St. Thomas points out from the first letter of St. John, he that hateth his brother is in darkness, right? Now, I think this will be surprising as a section for a lot of people. We tend to think, or maybe I'm an abnormal one, but I tend to think within the Christian mindset, we have this idea that people can be spitting on us and yelling at us and, directing all types of malice towards us, and we have to just love, right? We just love, right? Kind of a spiritual sense of just all love, right? That's how I respond to being treated with hatred, right? And St. Thomas doesn't say that, right? He doesn't say that. I think he is very practical. He calls that type of thing, like if somebody were to be yelling at you and spitting at you and telling, lying about you, if you were to love them in an emotional type of way, that's perverse. And God is not perverse, and he doesn't require us to do perverse things, right? So St. Thomas points out that in terms of your neighbor's nature, right, their human nature, you have to love them, right? You have to love your neighbor in their nature, right, in who they are. However, you do not have to love their actions, right? And we covered this before, where it's like, love the sin or hate the sin. I know people don't like that, but that is the St. Thomas's approach to some of these things, right? The person who's yelling at you, cursing at you, bad-mouthing you, you do have to love them, right? In terms of them being in the image and likeness of God in their humanity, you do not have to like the things that they are doing, right? You don't have to love that, right? In fact, you can hate that, right? Right? If somebody's cursing at you, you can hate that they're cursing at you, right? Presumably, you haven't done anything wrong, right? That's kind of a presumption here, right? If you're doing everything good and holy, and somebody is yelling at you, hating you, then it's appropriate to hate their hate, right? I know Martin Luther King wouldn't like that, right? Hate cannot dispel hate. Only darkness cannot dispel darkness. Only light can do that, right? True. However, if somebody is hating you, you can dislike that, right? You can dislike that. It's a defect in divine justice, right? Presuming you're on the right side of justice, if they were to hate you, they would be contrary to divine justice, right? And you don't have to like that. Now, in terms of, in the gospel it says, unless you hate your parents, hate your brothers and sisters, you cannot be my disciples. Well, should we be hating our neighbors? And I think St. Thomas gives a good point here, and you can see this in response to objection 1, where he points out, if your parents are asking you to go contrary to the divine commands, right? They're saying like they're forbidding you from going to Mass on Sunday, or they're requiring you to commit sin, then you can hate anything that they are asking of you to. You can hate anything they're asking you to do, right? You can hate the sin. Again, you still have to love and honor your parents in terms of their nature, but not in terms of what they're asking you to do. The same would be, again, true of your enemies, right? If somebody is sinning against you, you don't have to love the sin that they're going against you with. You could say, well, I love you as a person. I don't really like what you're doing, right? That's okay. That's a normal. Say, I love you and I'm okay that you're treating me badly. Well, that's perverse, and that's not okay, right? According to St. Thomas. Now, is the hatred of neighbor a grievous sin, right? The greatest sin against your neighbor. And St. Thomas points out, he says, yes and no, right? Yes and no. So, taking a quote from St. Augustine, he says, now there are sins by which man hurts his neighbor more than by hatred, right? Theft, murder, adultery, right? Is it better to be hated or be better to be murdered, right? Actually, I prefer my neighbor just hate me rather than murder me, right? Right? Somebody could hate me and I don't even know them, right? It has no effect on my life because I don't even know that they hate me, right? You're driving bad and you cut somebody off by mistake and you're not even aware that you did it, and now somebody hates you. They could hate you and you don't even know that you did anything, and you don't even know that they're angry, right? So I would much rather them be angry at me than trying to murder me, right? This would make some sense. But doesn't Jesus himself say, anyone who hates their brother and sister is a murderer, right? So hatred is a murderer. Well, St. Thomas says, and this is something we probably all struggle with, right? Is somebody who looks lustfully at a woman an adulterer equal to that of an actual adulterer? Is somebody who hates their brother and sister a murderer equal to that of an actual murderer, right? There has to be a difference in degree, right? Hatred is not as bad as actual murder. But how do we deal with this? Because it seems like that's what Jesus said. And St. Thomas says, well, you have to look at the internal act and the outward act. So the internal act is hatred. You hate your neighbor. Then if it becomes an outward act, yelling or murder or theft or whatever it is that you did because you hate your neighbor, right? It is now an outward act. So there are two different acts. There's the internal and the inward and the outward. Right, so at the heart of the outward act is the inward act, right? And St. Thomas points out you could accidentally kill someone, right, with no malice, right, no hatred. And that's not necessarily a sin, right? It would depend on the circumstances, but by accident you didn't. The outward act actually isn't evil, right? If somebody, Dick Cheney was hunting and he shot his friend in the face who survived, right? This was not with the intention of any type of malice. Therefore, the act is not necessarily sinful, right? Versus if you intended to shoot your friend, then that would be bad. Now, if you intend to shoot your friend and you don't shoot your friend, that's worse than accidentally shooting your friend, right? Because you intend negative, you have a negative intention, right? You have a malicious intention. The worst is malicious intention and malicious outward action, right? Inward and outward, both directed towards hatred, would be the worst. But in some ways, it's the inward intention that's more important. And this is interesting because in the American legal system, it's a similar thing, right? Similarly, with the Dick Cheney case, Dick Cheney wasn't charged for attempted murder or anything because he didn't intend to murder anyone, right? He didn't. You could maybe get sued for negligence, right, or civil damages, but there was no criminal intent, right? And the intent matters in law, and it matters in terms of ethics, right? In terms of morality. Now, St. Thomas says that hatred is not a capital sin. Well, you might, if you haven't watched all these in great detail, you might say, well, I don't even know what a capital sin is. So Gregory the Great points out a handful of capital sins, and they are sins, right, the 7 deadly sins, that give birth to others, right? So if you are envious, for example, envy then will lead into other sins. Gluttony leads into other sins, right? So it's like a mother who gives birth. A capital sin is like a mother who's going to give birth to children who are also vices, right? So is hatred a capital vice? Well, if you think back to the 7 deadly sins, right, you could say pride, lust, anger, greed, envy, sloth, right? You can go down the list of the 7 deadly sins. Hatred is not in there, right? So hatred is not listed as a capital sin, for one. So is hatred a capital sin? Well, first, St. Gregory doesn't say they are. And secondly, the point is that hatred seems to come not at the beginning, not as the start of other sins, but as the conclusion of other sins. So we end with hatred. So if we look to something like Cain and Abel, right? So Cain kills Abel. It started with envy, right? Probably a hit to his pride too, that his sacrifice wasn't accepted. So it was hit to his pride, and then there was envy, and it probably ended in anger, right? He got so angry he murdered his brother, right? So it didn't start with anger, it ended with anger. So, this could be an interesting discussion in a class if anyone's discussing this. Does hatred, is it at the beginning or is it at the end? Right? Because you could see somebody, driving down the road and somebody cuts you off and you get very angry, and then it leads to you screaming, blaspheming, driving recklessly. Somebody pulls out a gun and then now they murder somebody because of road rage or something. But it began with anger, right? So I think you could make an argument in both directions with this. Now, St. Thomas does point out it doesn't mean that no sin can come from anger, right? It could be anger, and then from anger could lead another sin, but it is not a capital sin, meaning it is not an original, it is not is not the origins of most sins, right? It's not one of the 7 origins of all of the vices. It's somewhere in the middle towards the end, right? Is this point. Describes it too as a gradual decline in love, right? So love is the ideal, right? So love is at the top, right? It's the best. And then if you keep moving away from love, the opposite of love is hatred. So if you have 2 extremes, right? Hatred on one side, love on the other, right? So it means there's a lot in between, right? So there, to get from all the way from love to hate, you decline into hatred. You don't start from hatred. Step 1 to 10. You got to take 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to 10, not 1, 10, right? So it does make some sense with that. Last article, does hatred arise from envy? And we're going to be covering envy in 2 more questions from now. And St. Gregory says, out of envy cometh hatred, right? So this is the capital sins, right? So envy leads to hatred, as I pointed out with Cain and Abel, right? It starts with envy and it turns to hatred. Now he says, since every sorrow of our neighbor's good, since envy is the sorrow of our neighbor's good, right? So when our neighbor gets something good, we feel sorrow, right? They get a new car, we feel bad, right? They get a better house, we feel bad, right? That's envy. It follows that our neighbor's good becomes hateful to us, so that out of envy cometh hatred, right? Again, it's the Cain and Abel story, right? Our neighbor wins the lottery, buys a bigger house, we get envious, and eventually we start to hate them, right? There was that movie, Ben Stiller, called Envy, right? Jack Black, I think it was. It was called Envy, and the neighbor wins the lot. Has this device, vaporize, and he gets really wealthy, and he has a horse, and he has a mansion next door, and they can't even afford a pool. So, right, it starts with envy, and it leads to hatred, right? So this makes some sense. So in conclusion, it is possible to hate God in effect, but not in essence. Hatred of God would be the greatest of sin, because love of God would be the greatest of virtue. It is possible to hate your neighbor, and it is the greatest of our sins against our neighbor. Hatred is not a capital sin. It's usually the final end of a sin, right? It's kind of a result of a sin. And hatred comes from envy. So a person often hates as a result of being envious first. Okay, so that is it for hatred, and we will move on to other internal aspects of the vices associated with virtue, right, next.